Well, good morning, church. How are we doing today? Does anyone have any guess on what book of the Bible we might be going to study this year? Any guess at all? What book are we going to be looking at today? Any guesses? That's right, Jonah and the whale. Exactly. We're going to be no, just kidding. Yeah, we're going to be talking about the book of Daniel this year. That's the book we're going to kind of be focusing on. We usually take a break for Christmas and Easter, but for the bulk of the year, we're going to be focusing in on the book of Daniel. So we're launching out in this new series. And did you know, even though that, I brought out a lion, and, I know Daniel's like your favorite name, just like it is, for me too. That lion instantly kind of made us think, oh yeah, Daniel and the lion's den, because it's a pretty iconic idea, right? But did you know that the story of Daniel and the lion's den actually didn't happen until very late in his life? Like he was in his 70s when he was thrown in the lion's den. So there was all kinds of things that happened in Daniel's life before that, and all kinds of things that are really important for us to take a look at, and we are going to do that. In fact, this book begins when Daniel was a very young man, in contrast to the story with the lions. He was probably only about 14 years old, and at this point in his life, everything in his life got turned upside down. Everything that he knew, everything that he experienced, everything that was maybe settled and comfortable in his thinking, like this is the trajectory of my life, all of that was erased and everything was changed at just 14 years old. Because the setting for the book of Daniel is not the kingdom of Israel, like we looked at last year with all the kings and kingdoms, right? That's what we looked at through the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. It wasn't the kingdom of Israel, and it also wasn't the New Testament church that we looked at this past summer through the book of Hebrews. No, it was in this in-between time. In this time in between the people of God being, in their land with their king, and there being the New Testament church, this in-between time when God's people were in exile. When God's people were in exile. They were no longer in the promised land, and they were not yet in the presence of the Messiah. They were in between these two significant time markers. That's where we find God's people living here in the book of Daniel. How did this happen, you might ask? Right? I mean, if you're thinking about last year when we talked about the kings and kingdoms and how God even was the king of these people, how could it possibly happen that a nation that has God as the one who is their protector and their provider and really even their ultimate king, how could it be possible they could be conquered and then be sent into exile? Well, the short answer is they brought it on themselves. They brought it on themselves because they ignored a very essential part of God's character. And this is the part they ignored. Even though God is patient, He is compassionate, He is loving towards His people, He is also completely faithful in that He always keeps His covenant promises. He always keeps His covenant promises. The fifth book of the Bible, it's the book called Deuteronomy. And it sounds kind of funny, Deuteronomy, what exactly is that? It actually means second law. Now, it wasn't an additional law. What it was it was the second time that God's people received the law from Moses. This particular time, they were standing on the edge of the promised land after they had just wandered through the wilderness for 40 years because of their disobedience. So many of the people had died off. It was a new generation. They were about to go into the promised land, and Moses had been told at this point, you are not actually going to get to go into the promised land. And so this Deuteronomy really is Moses' farewell address. He is giving them the law a second time. He's saying, these are the things that God has asked from us, His people. And so in his farewell address, Moses says, first of all, many things about the law, but then next he also pleads with them to remember this part of God's character, that God is always faithful to keep his covenant promises. Here's what he says at the end of Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 15. It says this. Moses is speaking to all the people, and he says, "See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil." You see the two sides, right? If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, that's life and good. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I commanded you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. That's the life is good part. But, he continues, but if your heart turns away, and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to enter and possess. I mean, picture that they're standing on the boundary line of the land that they are going to receive. And this is the thing that Moses sets up. Life and good, death and evil. And do you notice God doesn't say, listen, if you just behave perfectly, no. What is it? What is he saying? He's saying, listen, you need to obey my commands, but more than anything else, you need to serve me alone as God. Don't turn to other gods. God knows we can't keep his law perfectly. But that part, he's like, that part is the covenant. Do not turn to other gods. And Moses finishes then with this. He gave them the warning. He pleaded with them. He says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice and holding fast to him. For he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. And God's people did for a little while. Under the leadership of Joshua, and there eventually then the various judges, they did follow God. But eventually, you remember this from last year, they rejected God as their king, demanded an earthly king, and God allowed it with all the good and the bad that goes with having a king. And we looked at this last year, right? The first king, the first failed king, King Saul. And then the pinnacle of the kings of Israel, King David. And then everything went downhill from there. After David's son Solomon died, the kingdom was divided into two of his sons. And in the books of Kings and Chronicles, if you go through them, it gives a list of all of the kings from the divided nations, the northern and the southern kingdom. And the most common description of these kings, even though there were some bright spots, the most common description of king after king after king was they did evil in the sight of the Lord. They did evil in the sight of the Lord. So for generation after generation, God watched as his people continued to rebel against him, worshiping other gods, disobeying his commandments. Over and over again, they failed to keep their side of the covenant that God had made with them. They did exactly what Moses warned them not to do. And even though they certainly deserved it, God didn't just reach for the smite button. You know what I'm talking about? Right? I mean, we would have. Seriously, guys, that's it. Just bam, lightning bolt, done. No, he didn't. He was patient with them, loving to them, compassionate towards them. So what did he do? His children are rebelling against him. What did he do? He sent prophet after prophet to speak his word to them, to remind them of the covenant, to warn them of the consequences, and to plead with them to repent, to turn away from their rebellion against God. But the people, including the many kings, refused to do so. And so the setting for the book of Daniel is the fulfillment of the very things that the prophets warned God's people would happen. This is what will happen, guys, if you do exactly what God's people did. Hundreds of years after Moses, right, but still about 100 years before Daniel even, was born, the prophet Isaiah wrote this. Isaiah 39, 6 and 7. He said, "Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up to this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." Now, if you read Daniel 1, right, the reading for this week, then you know that would be a great summary for Daniel chapter 1. Because he's talking about Daniel and his three friends right there. 100 years before Daniel was even born. Isaiah is saying, yeah, the sons that are going to be born to you, this is what's going to happen to them. Now, if we were to move even closer to Daniel's lifetime, then the prophet Jeremiah prophesied both in Jerusalem and in Babylon. So he was a contemporary of Daniel. He lived in the same time frame. And in fact, he's commonly called, if you don't know this, he's commonly called the weeping prophet. Jeremiah is the weeping prophet. Well, why would he be called a weeping prophet? Because God said, listen, Jeremiah, I want you to go to my people. I want you to tell them these things. But you know what else God told him? God told them they're not going to listen to you. What a gig that is, right? Go tell the people to repent, and they're going to ignore you. Thanks. That'll go really well. And it didn't go very well. Jeremiah got arrested over and over again. He was constantly being threatened to be executed by the leaders of Israel. They were like, why don't you just get rid of this guy? This guy keeps talking all this stuff, and it's discouraging the fighting men. I would think so. But not enough to make a change. And they didn't make the change. They did not want to hear what Jeremiah had to say, because nobody likes bad news. And this is very bad news. So this is what Jeremiah said. Jeremiah 25, 4 to 9. He says, "You have neither listened nor inclined your ears to hear, although the Lord persistently sent to you all of his servants the prophets, saying, 'Turn now, every one of you, from his evil way and evil deeds, and dwell upon the land that the Lord has given you, and your fathers from of old and forever. Do not go after other gods to serve and worship them, or provoke me to anger with the work of your hands. Then I will do you no harm.'" God's like, I'm giving you this land. I'm giving you this land. I'm covenanting to give you this land if you will worship me alone. Yet, Isaiah continues, again, speaking from the words of the Lord, "Yet you have not listened to me, declares the Lord, that you might provoke me to anger with the work of your hands to your own harm. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send for all of the tribes of the north, declares the Lord, and for Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants, and against all of these surrounding nations. I will devote them to destruction and make them a horror, a hissing, and an everlasting desolation." What? I mean, do you hear what God is saying here? Did you hear what God called this pagan, wicked king, King Nebuchadnezzar? He was a ruthlessly violent man, the king of Babylon. And God said, he's my servant. In this case, he's serving me. That just kind of makes my mind spin. Does it yours? How is that even possible? How do we reconcile something Something like that. There's only one way that I know, and that is to do what they failed to do, and to remember that God made a covenant with these people, and God always keeps his covenant promises. One of the things that really has been standing out as I've been preparing for this series is how hotly the book of Daniel is debated in academic circles. I actually didn't even realize that. Some scholars would say even that the historicity of this book is even more hotly contested than the book of Genesis, which really surprised me because everybody's always going after that one. There's many reasons for this, but I think one of the primary ones is that much of the book of Daniel exhibits the traits of a certain type of literature. It's called apocalyptic literature. If you were to type this word into an online search engine, then you get a whole host of probably pop culture references to the apocalypse, with or without zombies. You know what I'm talking about? Right? The zombie apocalypse, that's apparently a pop culture thing. But the real meaning of the word is a little more applicable than that. We get the word apocalyptic from the Greek word apocalypsis, which means a revealing or an uncovering. That's why the book of Revelation is another apocalyptic literature. Revelation, to reveal. In a biblical sense, this is God kind of pulling back the curtain to reveal to his people both what is happening in any particular moment and what's going to happen in some point in human history. Many consider it a subset to the more general label of prophecy, and that makes sense. So they kind of take that and sort of aim at just the end time things, but it doesn't have to just be aimed at end time things. What I've found is that ultimately these attacks are leveled against the kind of things that we've already talked about here this morning, and maybe you didn't even realize that we've been talking about it. My hope is because you have a worldview that accepts those things as, okay, I get it. But not everybody has a worldview like that. Depending on the worldview that you walked in with today, you accepted a lot of the things that I said. You know what a worldview is? A worldview is the lens in which you read the world through. It's how you make sense of this world around you. It's how you set your values for what's important. It's how you see the world. And the worldview that the book of Daniel points to is one that says that there is a God who is so transcendent. That's the best way I can figure it out. It's not just up, but transcendent over our world, that he is not locked into the boundaries of space and time that we are helplessly locked into. That means that God not only just sort of knows what will happen, but he can interact with the happenings in this world, and does interact with the happenings in this world in such a way to ensure that everything happens according to his intended purposes. How does that exactly work? I don't know. That's the God variable in the equation. Because God exists outside of the time and space things that we are locked into. What I do know is that is how God can give his prophets the messages that he did hundreds of years before they came true. That's how God can call a far-off pagan king my servant and allow him to conquer his own people in order to accomplish a purpose that he has for them. That's how God can have Isaiah prophesy about the events of Daniel even before there even was a Daniel. And God could say, this is what's going to happen. Not just because I have seen it, but because I am making it so. And it's in this tension, right, that we are going to find both the challenges and the blessings of the book of Daniel. Because some of us, we don't really even realize this yet, but there are aspects of the idea of God knowing how the story of humanity is going to end that we just don't like. There's something in it that kind of seems deterministic to us. It seems, in some sense, it seems like a violation of our free will. How can you tell me that God's going to work all things out when I have a free will? I can decide to do whatever I want to do, and you're telling me God still is going to work that out to His intended end? Yeah. Our God can do that. Well, how does that work? I don't exactly know. I just know when you add the God variable into it, that changes everything. But it does bring up questions for us, questions that we're going to be grappling with. Questions like, well, then how can I be held responsible for my decisions when God has already predetermined the ending? Why am I responsible for it then, if He's just going to do what He's going to do anyway? Or a question like, if God is ultimately in control, then why doesn't He end the suffering I see? Those are deep questions. Those are difficult questions. They're good questions for us to grapple with. And my hope is that our study of Daniel this year will help us at least to begin to find the answers. And more than that, I hope it will help us, I hope it will elevate our understanding of God instead of seeing Him in the limited way that we do. Because we love the great stories of heroic courage, right? The lions and the three in the fire and the prophecies and the dream interpretation. I mean, we love those iconic stories of courage. But at the end of the day, thriving in adversity is only possible when an individual understands that no matter what I am facing in any given moment, God is still in control of the story of humanity. And that in His grace towards us, He always keeps His covenant promises. So if you haven't already, let me encourage you to open up to Daniel chapter 1. And we're going to just take a look at the first 7 verses from Daniel here in our time that we have left. I'm going to pray as you're doing that. And we'll grapple with these things together really all year. So let's stop and pray. God, it is good to be together with these people today. I believe You are honored in our coming together and gathering. Thank You for the freedom to do so, knowing that we have brothers and sisters around the world who do not have that freedom. Lord, help us to make the most of it today. Help us to be open to grappling with difficult things, both today and throughout this year. God, I thank You for the beautiful, vivid pictures of these stories of Daniel in the lion's den and the three in the fire. But I ask, Lord, that You would help us to go even deeper than that this year. Would You help us to understand the larger picture, and would You give us a more clear and more fuller picture of who You are through how You have worked throughout history and how You are continuing to work today. I pray these things in the name of Jesus. I pray these things. Amen. So as we begin to grapple with the idea of God sovereignly ruling over all of our world, even the dark parts, we can recognize in this story some of the dark tactics employed because they're things that we see actively in our world even today. At least categorically, if not, specifically because of the variable of the context. But the book begins, like I said, with the fulfillment of the prophecies we've looked at prophecies that Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and others talked about. And it says this. Daniel 1, 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Now, just in the first 2 verses of this book, we can see this sort of powerful footing that the rest of the book is going to be built upon. Right? What we've been talking about already. Do you see how from the very beginning God's transcendence is being highlighted here, isn't it? His sovereign hand at work with just these 2 verses. Now, what is it that's happening in our world? What would have been written on the front page of the newspaper in Babylon or in the secular history book? Nebuchadnezzar conquers Jerusalem, right? I mean, that's what would be written. Nebuchadnezzar did this thing. He conquered Jerusalem. But then Daniel gives us a different way to view that, doesn't he? What does verse 2 say? The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Did Nebuchadnezzar take God's people? No. The Lord gave them into his hand. That's something to grapple with. You see the difference there, right? 2 different views. One view that relies just on what can be seen from an earthly perspective. The other recognizes that no matter what is happening in our world, God continues to be at work, even in the difficult parts of the story of his people. God's still moving. And these temple vessels were not the only valuable thing the king carried off to Babylon. I would argue they weren't even close to as valuable as what else he took from Jerusalem. Verse 3. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. This is where we're bumping into our first difficult challenge, the challenge of isolation. Challenge of isolation. See, one of the tactics of the Babylonians, and actually many empires even after them, was to take, when you went to conquer, in all reality, Nebuchadnezzar did not go to Jerusalem to besiege it. He was on his way to Egypt. And he besieged Jerusalem on his way. So there were many nations in which Nebuchadnezzar conquered. And so what did he do? He'd go in and he'd conquer a particular people group, and he would take some of that people group and he would remove them, right, in chains, and he would force them to go live in a different area. And he would take that people from that other area, and he would take them and he would move them and put them back over to live in this area. And the real reason was to kind of diffuse or dismantle any regional loyalties to anyone else but the one thing that they had in common, and that is that we are under the rule of Babylon. So this isolation thing, to kind of mix all of the people up so they couldn't figure out their own identity kind of thing, that was a huge part of the tactics of empires who want to rule a larger and larger portion of the world. Because you can't get your army everywhere at once, and so the bigger you get, you have to start doing things a little bit differently. And isolation was a big part of that, scattering the people so that they couldn't come together around nationalistic, regional, or religious loyalties. That was a part of being a conquering empire. Isolation, being separated from the strength of familiar faces, familiar routines, familiar values in the people you are looking at, your neighbors, often then unlocked the door to all kinds of compromises that you start making. We could argue for survival. Yeah, probably. Right? And that was the idea. And it's really a brilliant tactic, evil as it is, right? Because it works. It works along the human tendency for us to follow the crowd unless we have a strong reason to resist it. Right? I mean, we can recognize that in ourselves, can't we? Kind of this idea of sort of go with the flow unless you know it leads somewhere you don't want to go. Right? Just sort of go with the flow unless you know that it leads somewhere that you don't want to go. And so you drop a person, especially a young person, that's the example here, into an entirely different world where they're interacting with people and places and ideas they've never interacted with before, never even dreamed about, and all of a sudden they have no idea where this flow is going because they've never seen these things before. That's why we have to be so careful. When our kids leave our homes, if they leave to go off to college and live somewhere far from home, we need to be careful to make sure we have prepared them to meet this challenge. Right? We need to make sure that they are plugged into a local church and a campus ministry of some sort, to make sure that they can have other people that can help them to make sense of all these new surroundings around them, so that they do not have their worldview so quickly compromised. They don't yet know where the flow is going to go. So how do they know if they shouldn't? Well, I'll just follow along until what? Could get to some dark places. But let me throw this one out as well. That was the first application that came to my mind, but this is another one that I've been grappling with this week, honestly for myself, because I think I struggle with this, and I imagine I'm not alone. Do you remember how the internet was billed as a way to bring the whole world together? Right? And there's some sense in which that's true, is it not? Like right now, I could take out this little pocket computer and I can push 2 buttons and I can get a message from a remote village on the other side of the world. Now that's pretty impressive, right? That's bringing the world together. But I can also walk through a crowd of people and half of them are like this. Right? And the other half of the time, I'm the one doing that. And so it really hit me this week. Ooh, you could be in a crowd of people and you're in isolation. So I really started to think about that. Is it isolating us in ways that most of us aren't even realizing? Maybe we're not careful enough with that. Something to think about this week. How might the isolating power of these little pocket computers that we have now, we call them phones, but come on, they're more than that, right? How can the isolating power of those things be opening us up to things that will lead us to compromising our worldview? And we don't even realize it because we don't even know where we're going, because all these new things have been opening up. I think we need to be careful. I encourage you to talk through that a little bit in the table talk groups later in Sunday school. Food for thought. And knowing how well this isolation things work, the king Nebuchadnezzar capitalizes on it with the second thing, and that's the challenge of indoctrination. The challenge of indoctrination. Right in the middle of that long word, you see the word doctrine, and usually we ascribe that to doctrine, what a church believes, but really a doctrine is what any individual person believes, whether it's biblical doctrine or just what their worldview is. The challenge of indoctrination. What does the king do? He gets the chief of the eunuchs, Ashpenaz, right? He was to bring the best and the brightest young men and prepare them to stand in the king's palace, similar to how he treated the temple vessels. The king looked at all these young men. He's like, well, that's a valuable resource. I don't want to just wipe them out. I want to make use of them. But it's a little more work to make use of people versus just, temple vessels. So he sends this Ashpenaz off to do that. So Ashpenaz was to do what? He was to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans, which is the Babylonians, okay? The king assigned them then a daily portion of the food that the king ate. You get the good stuff. And the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years. And at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Educated. That's a hot button topic for our culture today, isn't it? What is education? And how does it work? Well, the truth is, in this story, these young men had great potential to be the influencers of their day. King wanted to leverage that, tap into that potential. And his hope was that after suffering such a great loss, they would take the attitude, hey, if you can't beat them, right, join them. Join them. That's his hope. So he pulled out all the stops, trying to get them to abandon any previous loyalties as they bathed in present luxuries. Because he knew that if he could get these guys to abandon their way of life, it would have a trickle-down effect to others. That's true for each one of us. Now, we might not be princes and royal families, but each one of us has a sphere of influence that moves out from us. Now, in the text, we're not given much of a description of how ruthless Nebuchadnezzar was as a king. And we eventually do learn, though, that because of how ruthless he was, graduation day, that day when they were to stand before the king, had something of a pass-fail system that was much more do or die kind of system. I would guess that made them study all the harder. They were probably more invested in their education than any of us have ever been, with that hanging over their head. But reflecting on this, I can't help but think of Jesus' words in Matthew 10:16. He's sending his disciples out, right, into a hostile territory, and he says this, "Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." I think this is the key when it comes to facing any sort of attempts at indoctrination, right? Especially in a hostile setting, especially in one that's said to be called, educational. It's going to help grow you as an individual. Because I've come to believe this. I think it's true that every subject, every lesson at every level of education is always delivered from the worldview of the educator. It's always delivered from the worldview of the educated. And don't misunderstand me here. That's not me saying that, well, all teachers have some secret, fiendish intent. Not in any way at all. It's just a fact of what it means to be human. Each one of us have a worldview in which we communicate from. So it's not in and of itself an evil thing, but it's a very good thing to remember when we're in any sort of a educational environment, whether that be a work training or whether it be school in some way. Every lesson is being taught from a particular worldview. And it's so important then that we heed Jesus' words, right? I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be wise as serpents, innocent as doves. And this is why, because in any educational setting, whatever it might look like, we may have times when we have to follow through on an assignment that we disagree with. And other times, we may have to stand up and say, I'm sorry, I cannot in good conscience do what you're asking me to do. Of course, this isn't just for students in school, right? I mean, we could see this in all kinds of different environments. Our workplace, our friend groups, our extended family gatherings. We get together with some of them, and maybe they start talking about something or start asking us to do something, and we're like, sorry, I cannot in good conscience do what you're asking me to do. Sometimes we'll need to stand up. Sometimes it might just be us leaving the conversation. being as wise or shrewd as we can to kind of avoid the tensions that are growing there. That's what wisdom is. Wisdom isn't just about knowing right from wrong. I mean, that's a beginning. But wisdom is how to put that into action. And sometimes those decisions are not super easy. The last challenge that the opening verses of Daniel highlight is the challenge of identity. Identity. And all three of these challenges we're going to see in story after story here in the first half of Daniel, of course. But they're in the first 7 verses as well. And it's here that we meet the main characters of this book. Daniel 1, starting with verse 6. Among these, right, the best and the brightest. So it wasn't just these 4. Among these, the best and the brightest of people of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. Outside of Daniel, you probably didn't recognize the names in the first list, did you? But Rakshak and Benny, I got those, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But hey, Shakespeare wrote, right? What's in a name, right? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but it wouldn't sound as Jewish. The Jewish people, your name was your connection to your people, to your family, to your tribe, to God's people. And each one of the names, Daniel, and I don't have them memorized either, right? Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they were all connected in some way to how they were to serve the Lord. And the new names that they received were all connected to some pagan god of the Babylonians. And from the Babylonians' perspective, this was just another push to disconnect these young men from their heritage and to start identifying as Babylonians. Right? They're trying to make that happen. But here's the thing, this is not one of the places where they took a stand. And we'll get into this over and over again, but God's law does not demand that people call you a particular thing. If someone else is going to call you something, God's law doesn't forbid that for you. And so, as far as we understand, they answered to those names. They answered to them. Identity is a big buzzword in our culture today, right? We know that. People are often confused, not just about who they are, but even about what it is that determines who they are. But as Christians, we see our life through a particular worldview. A worldview where our transcendent and sovereign God, who's working all things to His intended end, He is the one who tells us who we are. He is the one. And as far as we read throughout the book of Daniel, these 4 young men did not forget who they were. Or maybe more appropriately, they did not forget whose they were. Even though Daniel and his friends were in a very difficult situation. Why were they there? Because God's people forgot this attribute of God. They forgot the covenant they made with God. But God does not forget covenants, or this covenant or any other covenant He has made. God gave His people into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar for a period of time. Not forever, for a period of time, for His purposes. Nebuchadnezzar did not take them from him. And this evil king was not allowed to just wipe them all out. Now, why not? Because God had other covenants to keep. Like the covenant He made with Adam and Eve, to send a seed of Adam to crush the serpent's head. And the covenant He made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to bring that snake crusher through their family line. And the covenant He made with King David to give that anointed one, that Messiah, that Christ, an eternal throne. And when Jesus finally did come, the promised snake-crushing anointed one from Abraham's line, he gave us a new covenant in his blood, didn't he? We celebrated that last week through communion. And that covenant is not conditional on our works, but entirely based on the work of Jesus Christ. It's based on who Jesus is, that he came, died, rose again, ascended to heaven, but hear this, but not before promising to return for us. And God always keeps his covenant promises. Invite the worship team forward as I pray. God, we thank you that you keep your promises. We know we are not faithful, but you are faithful. And Lord, I pray that you would help us to grapple well with the things in this book this next year. I ask for your blessings on it. I ask for the table talk groups and the Sunday school classes that will be looking into your word this morning. Lord, I pray that you would bring good discussions, a sharpening among your people, that you would help us to be able to sharpen each other through what you've given us in your word, through what you're teaching us in this life. Lord, I pray that you would help us to see more clearly through a biblical worldview, understanding who you are, God, more fully and more completely, that we might be able to understand our world better and how you are operating in it and the role you have given us to play in it. Lord, I pray you would do these things for your glory and for our good. I pray this in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.